Ibrahim Traoré attacks Netanyahu. The clash that shocked the world. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream too. The World Strategic Peace Conference in Geneva had never witnessed a year like this. Global leaders poured into the glass and steel colossus of the United Nations Assembly Hall, escorted by armored convoys and television cameras. The air was stiff with diplomatic rehearsals and silent rivalries, each speech carefully crafted to say nothing while appearing brave. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, had arrived days earlier, not with a motorcade, but with a small team of young advisors and a single worn notebook. He hadn't come to be celebrated. He came with a truth no one wanted spoken aloud. And deep down, he knew this stage had already been rigged against voices like his. In the dressing rooms of the elite, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu prepared his address with a familiar calm. He was used to commanding attention, his words feared, dissected, and echoed across screens. Yet this year, a subtle unease clung to the corridors. The war in Gaza, the mounting international criticism, the accusations of excessive force, they had followed him here, woven into every whisper. Still, Netanyahu remained composed. "They'll talk," he told his aides, "but they won't act. Not against us." His speech was sharp, deflective, masked in historical justifications. He was certain that when he left the stage, the applause would cleanse the record once more. Ibrahim Traoré sat silently in the third row of the assembly, his hands clasped and eyes locked on the podium. As Netanyahu spoke of sovereignty and defense, Traoré didn't blink. Around him, delegates nodded cautiously, aware of the cameras, of donor dollars, of reputations. But in Traoré's chest, a slow fire began to build. He could hear the silence in the room, an approval not spoken, but implied. This silence, he thought, is why the children of Gaza bleed in dust. The speech ended. Applause rose. Netanyahu stepped down, triumphant. And then the announcement came, the next speaker, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The room hushed. As Traoré approached the podium, every breath in the hall seemed to hold. He didn't open his notes. He didn't greet the assembly. He placed both palms on the edges of the podium and looked straight at Netanyahu. "You speak of defense," he began, voice calm but piercing. "But I see occupation dressed in fear. I see children's bones beneath rubble you justify." A ripple passed through the room. Cameras shifted. Aides panicked. "You call it protection. I call it betrayal of every principle this very building claims to stand for." Netanyahu stared back, lips tight. Traoré didn't flinch. "And if silence makes you comfortable, let this be the moment that ends it." The echo of Traoré's words hadn't yet faded when a visible tension spread through the assembly hall like a storm front. Diplomats exchanged glances, unsure whether to remain silent or clap, or leave. Traoré's voice had pierced a sacred veil, the kind of unspoken agreement that allowed war to coexist with diplomacy. He hadn't issued an insult, he had issued an accusation. And not just against Netanyahu, but against everyone who had nodded, applauded, funded, or remained indifferent. Netanyahu, still seated in the front, leaned slightly forward. His face bore the practiced calm of a seasoned operator, but his knuckles whitened against his armrest. Ibrahim continued, each word deliberate, unwavering. "The world does not suffer from lack of intelligence," he said, eyes scanning the rows of delegates. "It suffers from the abundance of cowardice. You claim neutrality while watching genocide unfold on live television." His voice never rose, but its weight grew heavier with each sentence. "Africa has buried its silence for too long. We know occupation. We know the cries of mothers unanswered. I came here not for applause, but for accountability." The room, designed to seat hundreds, now felt like a trial chamber, and every representative, a defendant in history's quiet court. Some delegates began to stir uncomfortably. A few quietly left their seats. The Israeli delegation looked to Netanyahu for a response, but he remained still, watching. A journalist from Al Jazeera whispered, This is history." Western media teams fumbled with camera angles, unsure if they were broadcasting a diplomatic scandal or a reckoning. Meanwhile, Traoré paused only once, long enough to let the weight of what he said settle. "When your missiles silence babies," he said, "you do not protect a nation, you erase a generation." The line didn't need commentary. It stood on its own, cold and naked in the bright lights of international scrutiny. Finally, Traoré closed his statement with a quiet warning. To the leaders who hide behind borders while funding bullets, history is watching. And this time, Africa is too. He stepped away from the podium. No applause. Just stillness. Then, a single delegate from South Africa rose and clapped. Slowly, defiantly. Another from Bolivia followed. Then one from Haiti. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was louder than silence. Netanyahu didn't move. Traoré didn't look back. As he exited the chamber, escorted only by 2 young aides, one thought remained. He hadn't just challenged a man, he had challenged a system. And it had heard him. The speech made global headlines within hours. Newsrooms scrambled to reframe their narratives, unsure whether to denounce or deify Ibrahim Traoré. In Tel Aviv, anchors condemned his reckless provocation. In Paris and London, think tanks debated whether he had violated diplomatic etiquette. But in Accra, Nairobi, Johannesburg, he was hailed as a lion. Finally, a Nigerian student tweeted, "Someone told the truth on the record, in the room, to the man." The internet surged with clips of the moment Traoré stared directly at Netanyahu. His words, raw and without euphemism, spread in dozens of languages. And in the silence that followed, millions felt their own voices awaken. Netanyahu, behind closed doors, was livid. Not because Traoré had insulted him, he'd endured worse, but because of the optics. Israel's allies had remained mostly silent, fearing backlash from a newly energized African and Global South audience. The Prime Minister's team drafted an emergency statement, painting Traoré as emotionally unstable and uninformed about regional threats. But the statement backfired. African leaders, many previously neutral, began to signal support, not necessarily for Traoré's attack, but for the fact that he had dared to challenge a status quo that had long gone unchallenged. A quiet shift was unfolding, and Netanyahu knew it. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, an emergency virtual session was held. Delegates discussed issuing a formal statement defending Traoré's right to speak truth to power. "This isn't about Israel alone," said the delegate from Rwanda. "This is about dignity, about the right to confront injustice without being labeled unstable." For the first time, nations that had historically avoided open critique of Western allies began reconsidering their positions. Traoré had cracked something wide open, and though he hadn't sought a movement, he now found himself at the center of one, its reluctant, unwavering spark. In Ouagadougou, the president returned to a hero's welcome. Thousands lined the streets, waving flags, holding up signs that read, "Burkina speaks for the silenced," and "You stood, so we rise." But Traoré didn't smile. Not fully. In the quiet of the presidential compound that night, he sat alone on a terrace, reading dozens of handwritten letters from Palestinian children, smuggled out of Gaza. One ended with, "Thank you for saying what we cannot. Thank you for not being afraid." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his chest pocket. "Now," he whispered to the wind, "let's see if they listen." 3 days after the Geneva speech, the UN Security Council called a closed-door emergency session. Traoré was not invited. The official reason given was procedural, but the real reason whispered behind velvet curtains was simpler. Fear. Fear that giving him another microphone would unravel years of carefully negotiated silence. Inside the chamber, world powers debated whether his words constituted a breach of diplomatic protocol. But as they argued about language and optics, outside, something far more powerful was growing: a public awakening. Citizens around the world began questioning why truth sounded like rebellion, and why those who spoke it were cast as threats. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim sat in council with his advisors, many of them barely older than 30. "The backlash is coming," one warned. "They will try to isolate you. Economically, politically." Traoré nodded. "Then we make peace with being isolated," he replied. "If that's the cost of standing with children buried under rubble, I will pay it." His voice was calm, but steel threaded through every word. His cabinet was divided. Some pushed for caution, urging him to issue a clarification, to smooth the message. But Traoré refused. "If the world needs my silence to remain comfortable, then they were never interested in peace. Only in quiet." Meanwhile, Netanyahu began rallying support from his strongest allies. U.S. senators issued statements condemning Traoré for divisive rhetoric. European leaders remained vague, neither endorsing nor condemning his speech. But the silence from many African and Latin American nations was telling. It was not weakness, but calculation. Traoré had exposed something deep and structural: the discomfort of the powerful when confronted by the powerless who will no longer bow. For the first time in decades, Western dominance over moral framing was being challenged, not by tanks or treaties, but by truth. A truth too raw for press releases. That night, Ibrahim wrote a private letter, not to Netanyahu, but to the Secretary General of the UN. "If speaking truth costs me my seat at your table, so be it," it read. "But know this: a table that demands silence from the wounded to preserve the comfort of the powerful is not peace, it is performance." He ended the letter with a request that the next Security Council session include delegates from Gaza, not just about Gaza. Then he folded it, sealed it with wax, and handed it to his aide. "They will ignore it," the aide said. Traoré looked up, unwavering. "They might, but the world won't." The backlash came faster than expected. Within 48 hours, 3 Western aid agencies announced they were reassessing partnerships with Burkina Faso, citing growing instability and concerns about leadership rhetoric. International banks slowed loan processing. Several European embassies quietly recalled senior diplomats from Ouagadougou. But for Traoré, the message was clear. The system was speaking, not in words, but in pressure. "They won't challenge you with argument," one advisor murmured. "They'll try to starve you with silence." Still, Ibrahim remained composed. He'd studied this tactic before. It was colonialism reborn in contracts and headlines. And he had no intention of blinking. Inside the presidential palace, heated discussions broke out among his economic team. The finance minister, older and pragmatic, was blunt. "We're playing with fire. Cut off from aid, our reserves won't last a year." Another advisor added, "You have support on the streets, yes, but markets don't care about speeches. They care about compliance." Traoré stood at the head of the table. "Let me be clear," he said. "I did not speak in Geneva to shake markets. I spoke to awaken morality. If the price of truth is discomfort, then let us be uncomfortable." He paused, his voice firm. "They want to make an example of us. Let's give them a different lesson." Outside, the people remained resolute. Artists painted murals of Traoré with children of Gaza behind him. Students gathered nightly to read excerpts of his speech aloud in parks. Mosques and churches prayed for protection. But underneath the solidarity, anxiety brewed. Prices began to rise. Fuel shipments slowed. Rumors of sabotage spread. Some accused foreign agents of tampering with supply routes. Others whispered of coups, quiet deals, and attempts to pressure military elites. Traoré responded not with repression, but with transparency. He held town halls, broadcast live conversations. "This is not just my burden," he told citizens. "It is our moment, and we carry it together." One night, a message arrived at the palace. unsigned, encrypted. It read, "Stand down now, or risk destabilizing your region. History will forget your speech, but not the chaos that follows it." Ibrahim read it twice, then handed it to his security chief without expression. "This is not new," he said. "Only now, they don't wear uniforms. They wear diplomacy." He stood by the window, looking out at the capital's lights. "Let them come. But we will not kneel." In that moment, the stakes were no longer symbolic. The world had chosen confrontation over reflection. And Traoré, alone but unwavering, had chosen to face it head-on. In the quiet corridors of Addis Ababa, the African Union headquarters buzzed with unusual urgency. A special summit had been called, not officially in response to Traoré's speech, but everyone knew why they were there. Leaders arrived with tight smiles and cautious optimism. Some feared division. Others saw opportunity. Ibrahim Traoré walked into the hall not as an invited guest, but as a storm too large to ignore. He wasn't alone anymore. Behind him stood the representatives of 7 African nations who had begun to echo his sentiments in public. What had started as a solitary call was quickly becoming a chorus. The doors closed. Cameras were shut out. What followed was 6 hours of brutal honesty. Some leaders accused Traoré of endangering Africa's fragile economic progress. "We cannot afford idealism," said one minister. "Not when our people still beg for bread." Others, younger, rose in his defense. "What is progress if it comes soaked in blood?" asked a delegate from Senegal. "Are we to stay quiet so our children may inherit silence?" Traoré listened, his hands folded, until the room settled. Then he spoke. Slowly, deliberately. "We've danced to borrowed songs for too long. We've sold our dignity for visas and grants. If speaking the truth causes discomfort, then let that discomfort shake us awake." Outside the room, international observers speculated wildly. Was the African Union splitting? Would sanctions be levied? Would Traoré be isolated or elevated? Inside, something unprecedented happened. A motion was proposed to create an independent African Human Rights Monitoring Committee that would investigate war zones globally, Gaza included, and report directly to African citizens, not foreign powers. The vote was close, but it passed. For the first time, the continent wasn't waiting for Europe or the UN to define justice. It was creating its own lens. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one truth had emerged: Africa would no longer be spoken for. That night, Traoré returned to his hotel, exhausted but unshaken. His aide handed him a report, footage from Gaza, showing children watching clips of his speech on smuggled phones. One girl looked into the camera and whispered, "Ibrahim, we heard you." He sat in silence for a long time, then leaned back and closed his eyes. The world had mocked his defiance, punished his audacity, but somewhere in a shattered home far away, a child had found hope in his words. "This," he murmured, "is why we do not retreat." The war was no longer diplomatic. It was moral, and it had only just begun. As the new African Human Rights Committee prepared its first mission to Gaza, global attention intensified. Western diplomats scrambled to discredit the initiative, calling it symbolic, biased, and lacking authority. But beneath their polished language was panic. For decades, Africa had been expected to observe, not investigate; to comment, not confront. Now, under Traoré's influence, the continent was demanding a seat at the moral table. In response, several donor nations announced temporary funding suspensions, hoping to fracture the unity. Yet something had shifted. Leaders who once feared standing alone now found courage in standing together. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu faced mounting pressure of his own. Domestically, protests intensified, citizens demanding accountability not just for the war, but for growing isolation abroad. In private meetings, his advisors warned, this is no longer about one African president. It's about a shift in global tone. Netanyahu, visibly tense, responded. Then we control the tone. Orders were issued. International media outlets began receiving heavily edited leaks discrediting Traoré's administration. False economic figures, fabricated military abuses, unverified whistleblowers. But the strategy backfired. African journalists, newly emboldened, investigated and exposed the smear campaign. Instead of silencing Traoré, it amplified him. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré met with regional leaders to secure safe passage for the committee's travel into Gaza through Egypt. It was a diplomatic nightmare. Visas were delayed, permissions revoked. Western embassies applied quiet pressure on Cairo. Yet amidst this, a surprising ally emerged: Jordan. King Abdullah, long critical of the war, publicly endorsed the African delegation's right to witness. When silence becomes policy, he said, truth must cross borders. The announcement stunned the global establishment. Suddenly, the mission wasn't an African statement, it was a global one. The global South was speaking in one voice, and the world could no longer ignore it. Inside the presidential war room, Traoré stared at a satellite image of Gaza, his fingers tracing the fractured neighborhoods. We are not here to rescue, he told his team. We are here to reveal. His voice carried no arrogance, only duty. We go not as heroes, but as mirrors, to reflect what others refuse to see. Around him, young analysts, translators, medics, all volunteers, nodded. They were not diplomats. They were witnesses. And they were ready. The first plane was scheduled to depart in 72 hours. As they prepared, Ibrahim paused by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. This is what it means, he whispered, to carry the burden of the voiceless. The morning of the delegation's departure, an anonymous diplomatic cable leaked online. It contained veiled threats from 3 Western governments warning of long-term consequences if Burkina Faso persisted in interfering in sensitive international affairs. News outlets framed it as proof of Traoré's recklessness. Commentators questioned whether he had pushed too far, whether he was risking not just his nation's economy but regional stability. Traoré read the document in silence. Then, with the calm of a man who had buried fear long ago, he handed it to his press secretary. Release it, he said. Let the world see what sensitivity means when it covers war crimes. The backlash was swift. The World Bank suspended talks for infrastructure funding. Military aid was quietly frozen. A major West African airline cancelled all routes to Ouagadougou, citing logistical difficulties. Inside the palace, advisors were panicked. We cannot survive this pressure, one said. They are turning the world against us. Traoré stood slowly, walking to the center of the strategy room. No, he said. They are revealing it. He pointed to a map of Africa, covered with red dots representing foreign bases, contracts, debts. This was never ours. Now they fear we are remembering that. His words weren't resistance, they were declaration. As the African delegation landed in Cairo, Israeli officials blocked their passage into Gaza. They cited security concerns and lack of coordination. Cameras swarmed the airport. International journalists asked if Traoré would order a retreat. But he didn't speak. Instead, he stepped forward and sat down in the middle of the terminal, cross-legged in full uniform. His delegation followed. Dozens of travelers watched in stunned silence as one of Africa's most powerful leaders staged a silent protest on foreign soil. 4 hours, he sat unmoved, unblinking, facing east toward Gaza. It was not a spectacle. It was a prayer and a challenge. By nightfall, the image had circled the globe. From Johannesburg to Jakarta, people posted photos with the caption, "He sat for Gaza." Hashtags trended. Artists painted murals in real time. In New York, demonstrators projected his image onto the UN building. The pressure shifted. Human rights groups issued statements. Former UN envoys called for Israel to allow access. By midnight, a call came from the Jordanian embassy. Passage was approved through an alternative route. The team would enter through Rafah. Ibrahim Traoré stood up slowly, joints stiff but spirit sharp. "Let them block doors," he said. "We will walk through walls." When Ibrahim Traoré crossed into Gaza through the Rafah border, no cameras were allowed. No press flanked his convoy. The world only knew he had entered by the tremor of silence that followed. Streets lined with rubble gave way to hospitals overcrowded with the wounded. The air was heavy with the scent of dust, sweat, and mourning. Yet amid the destruction, children ran barefoot, chasing the convoy with curious eyes. As Traoré stepped out of the vehicle, an old woman pressed a trembling hand against his chest and whispered, "We thought no one would come." He placed his hand over hers. "I came to see. I came to carry your voice." The African delegation, now operating as a civilian rights mission, spent the next 48 hours documenting conditions. They spoke with doctors performing surgeries without anesthesia, parents searching for children under collapsed buildings, teachers holding lessons in broken courtyards. Traoré didn't conduct interviews, he listened. Not like a politician, but like a man absorbing the truth with no filter. One child, no older than 6, handed him a crayon drawing. A family under a sky full of drones. "That's home," the boy said. Traoré knelt down and took the drawing. "I will show this to the world," he promised. "And I will not change a single line." On the third day, they gathered in a bombed-out school to record testimonies. With only solar-powered cameras and handwritten transcripts, they captured dozens of stories. Raw, painful, necessary. The goal was not to shame or accuse. It was to remember. "We are here to preserve truth," Traoré said, "because too often it dies with the innocent." When asked by a local journalist what he would tell the UN upon his return, he replied, "That your children bleed the same as theirs. That your pain does not require translation. That history will no longer be written without you." The journalist wept. No further questions were asked. That night, Traoré stood before a group of Gazans, under a pale moon and shattered sky. He held the crayon drawing above his head. "This," he said, "is your story. And I swear it will not disappear into the silence they built for you." Behind him, a line of children stood, holding candles made from melted wax and thread. The wind blew, the candles flickered, but none went out. Traoré turned back toward the border. The mission was not over, but something had changed. He had entered Gaza as a witness. He was leaving as its voice. And now the world would have to listen, or be judged by its silence. The following morning, under extraordinary security, a closed session was convened between Ibrahim Traoré and Benjamin Netanyahu. Neither man had asked for the meeting, but the UN Secretary-General insisted, "Two voices cannot shake the world and never speak face to face." The room was small, windowless, and guarded. No press. No transcripts. Just two leaders and their most trusted advisors. Traoré entered first, posture firm. Netanyahu followed minutes later. Expression unreadable. The silence that settled between them was electric. Two storms waiting to collide. Then Netanyahu spoke, "You're reckless. You've endangered stability for spectacle." Traoré didn't flinch. "No. I've endangered lies." Netanyahu leaned forward, his voice cold. "You do not understand what this region requires. You mistake simplicity for courage. We live with threats you cannot imagine." Traoré's eyes narrowed. "I imagine children buried under collapsed buildings. I imagine mothers screaming in silence." "Is that the threat you speak of?" The room tensed. An Israeli aide stood to interject, but Netanyahu raised a hand. "You're not a revolutionary," he hissed. "You're a disruption." Traoré stood. "And yet, the world is listening." He walked toward the door, then turned. "If your power depends on silence, Prime Minister, it was never power, it was permission. And that permission is ending. The confrontation leaked, pieces of dialogue whispered to journalists, summarized in diplomatic memos. Some called it a historic mistake. Others called it the most honest conversation ever held within UN walls. But it wasn't the confrontation that made headlines, it was what followed. Ibrahim Traoré announced that Burkina Faso would formally recognize the state of Palestine. Hours later, Senegal, Mali, and Namibia did the same. Within 2 days, 5 more African nations followed. For the first time, recognition didn't come as a gesture of solidarity. It came as an act of alignment with moral clarity. The global map was shifting, not with war, but with will. That night, Netanyahu held a press conference. His tone was sharp, defiant. Israel will not be dictated to by theatrics. We protect our citizens. Always. But even as he spoke, protests erupted in Tel Aviv, not against Traoré, but against the normalization of war. Families of fallen soldiers held up signs that read, "Not in our name." In Ouagadougou, the people filled the streets once more, not to celebrate victory, but to prepare for what would come next. Traoré knew the storm would not pass quickly, but the line had been drawn. He had looked the face of power in the eye and did not blink, and that, the world would never forget. Weeks passed. The initial flames of media attention began to settle, but the fire Traoré had sparked continued to smolder beneath diplomatic layers. The UN was divided, unsure whether to censure him or call for reform. Some countries pushed for sanctions, others proposed him for the Nobel Peace Prize. What no one could deny was this: he had forced a conversation the world had tried to avoid for decades. And he hadn't done it with armies or threats, but with presence. With a voice that refused to tremble, and a truth that refused to be framed. He hadn't just confronted Netanyahu, he had confronted every leader who found comfort in distance. In Gaza, Ibrahim's visit became legend. Murals of him and the barefoot children he stood beside appeared across refugee camps. An anonymous poet wrote, "He came not with weapons, but with ears." And in listening, he shook the ground. The African Human Rights Delegation released a damning report that was circulated globally, documenting not just destruction, but abandonment. It concluded with a sentence that made front-page headlines in 5 continents. To remain neutral in the presence of such pain is to take a side, and it is not justice's side. The world could no longer say it didn't know. The world had seen, because he made them look. Back home, Traoré refused hero worship. He dismantled all personality cults rising in his name. "This was never about me," he said. "It was about dignity, and our refusal to let it be negotiated." He shifted national priorities toward youth education and media literacy, launching Pan-African programs to teach children how to tell their own stories before others told them wrong. "We do not need permission to be human," he told a group of students. "We only need memory, and the courage to protect it." Foreign aid remained restricted, but African nations began forging new trade alliances, building on shared principles instead of foreign expectations. One evening, alone on the roof of the presidential residence, Ibrahim looked at the stars, the same ones that watched over Gaza. He took the small crayon drawing from his breast pocket, the one with the drone, the mother, the sky. He placed it on a table beside him and lit a candle. Not for ceremony, but for memory. As the wind played with the flame, he whispered, "I did not end their suffering, but I carried it into the room where suffering is usually sold." And in that quiet moment, with no applause and no cameras, Ibrahim Traoré smiled, not because he had won, but because the silence had finally lost. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.